In the sit-down, the Moth, renowned for its captivating storytelling, is set to make a return to Johannesburg on Saturday, the 16th of March, after an 8-year hiatus. The theme is the power of possibilities. It will feature a diverse lineup of storytellers, headlined by South Africa's own Nsovo Mayimele, with international talents such as Turkey-based Syrian Mohammed Yassim and Kenya's Webster Makombe. Johannesburg's own Lebo Mashile will host this event. Mashile is one of South Africa's most famous poets whose storytelling fuses poetry with other forms like dance, theatre, visual art and music. Well, I'm joined in studio by both Mashile and Mayimele. A very good morning to you both. Welcome to Newzroom Afrika.
Morning.
Morning.
What an exciting event. I mean, Lebo, let me start with you. I mean, your poetry can transport listeners to places they've never been before. And now you're part of this exciting event. Talk to us about your role and what the Moth is all about.
So the Moth is an organization that has been going now since, I think, 1997. They have a podcast. Many people know them from the podcast. The podcast gets 100 million listeners in a year. They've told over 60,000 stories in cities all over the world. So it's a live event with 5 storytellers and a host. Each storyteller tells a 10 to 12 minute story. The story must be true. At this particular event, all of our storytellers are activists and advocates who are using their stories to raise awareness about the particular issues that are being spoken about in their stories and what they've lived through. So these are storytellers who have been workshopped, but they're not necessarily professional storytellers. You can find the lady sitting next to you on the taxi, you can find an artist, you can find an activist, you can find whoever, as long as they have a human, first-person, real, interesting, engaging story to tell, then they can be a part of the Moth. And it's a global phenomenon. It's like a cult movement. It has a global cult following of millions. It's a huge thing. They were in Joburg in 2016, as you said, and this is their first time back since the pandemic. Already tickets are selling to show kind of how much support there is already in the city for this platform. We will be at the University of Johannesburg next week, Saturday, 6:15, at the Theatre. So for me as a poet, narrative is essential. You know, the storytelling is it's a human function. This is how we identify with each other. This is how we make memory. This is how we make meaning. This is how we make sense of what's happening around us. This is also how we humanize politics. This is how politics go from being, you know, what can be desensitizing headlines that we see a lot, you know. Those headlines become real, become people, become living, breathing human beings like us through the power of story. Yeah,
that's absolutely incredible. And Nsovo, I know that you are one of these storytellers, not necessarily a professional storyteller, but a professional in the healthcare space, a pharmacist, a lecturer who has a lot to say about the dynamics of that field. What is your story?
Well, I can't really tell you the full story because then I'll be jumping the gun. But in terms of the story, I've got so many stories to tell. I didn't realize that I had so many stories to tell until I was workshopped by the Moth, where you learn the power of storytelling and also how to pack your stories. So for me, I would say that my stories are being told every day. I tell my stories to my students when I'm teaching. I tell my stories to patients when you're working with them. So I believe you have a story as well. And you would be able to pack it and also to just present it in a way that is appealing. Through the training of the Moth or the work that they do, the amazing work that they've been doing so far.
Lebo touched on humanizing politics, those bold headlines that you see in the newspapers. And of course, there's a lot to be said about what's happening in the health space, the challenges and the big shortfalls that leave. I mean, just yesterday I was speaking to a health expert who was talking about how there's so many gaps within hospitals hospitals and how patients are not able to get the proper assistance they deserve, and how they're being treated by healthcare workers. That in itself speaks to the big role that storytellers have to play in making sure that these are not just numbers, but the voices behind the headline.
That's very true. I very much agree with that. And I mean, it's very well known that we are going through challenges within the healthcare industry. And it's an industry that is based on human rights and also based on humans that you are trying to, better their lives of. So when you look at, for example, myself, when I got involved with the Moth, I was a health activist at that time, a young health activist. And that part of the stories that I was able to tell through that were stories of patients that I was engaged with at that point of time. And, whenever you tell a story behind, I mean, you talk about a stock out of medicines.
Yeah.
That is just on the surface. But then when you start to humanize about why, okay, let's say it's an old woman who took her money to catch a taxi. She cannot walk properly, goes to a hospital, and then there's a stock out. And you kind of explain that that money could have been used to actually transport or feed her grandchildren that she stays with. So the power of storytelling comes into play, because at least then you get to get the story behind the real problem. And each and every problem is made of minor problems that can actually, if you want to solve the big problem, you start with those small problems which are considered minor. Yeah.
Lebo, this is health perspective that we're talking about, but of course there will be other topics with other storytellers. What are the other angles that will form part of this big narrative?
So all of the storytellers who are on this platform for this particular show are all activists and advocates like Nsovo in some way, but from different parts of our continent, even the world. There's a Zimbabwean storyteller, there's a Malawian storyteller, there is a gentleman who is from, he's based in Turkey but is from Syria. So these are places in the global south that are experiencing, have experienced violence or are dealing with the realities of a post-colonial, economy and political landscape. These are places that are dealing with gross inequality, like us. So we know what it is to live in a society where the headlines are so glaringly negative. But within those headlines, we are also living lives where we're falling in love and we're making art and we're making connections and we're expressing ourselves and we're creating culture. Life happens in between the headlines, and even while war is going on, while we're dealing with all the crime and the inequality and the corruption and the build up to the elections, we're still just South Africans who are living and loving. People are giving birth. That's the human aspect of it, So I hope that sometimes it's very easy to paint a country as like a monolith. You hear Zimbabwe, or you hear Malawi, you hear Kenya, Nairobi, you think one thing, I think human stories have a way of showing that all of us are layered, all of us are complex. We go through the same things in different realities, and if we are able to identify that humanness within the next person, we can find empathy and compassion and deal from a place, of genuine connection instead of reducing people to stereotypes, boxing people, reducing whole countries, whole landscapes to just like wastelands. We don't need to engage with this place because we know what it's all about. You don't know.
Yeah.
You don't know until you've lived it.
Your storytelling fuses poetry with other forms of art, dance, music. I mean, how are you going to be part of this with all those other mediums as you tell your powerful story through poetry?
The power of the Moth is in first-person narrative. So it's one person, one at a time, standing up in front of a mic. I also have to stick to that form. We're in a theater. And the idea is to create a very intimate space to pull people into the story. So I won't be coming with lots of bells and whistles.
Okay.
My job is to make the space, to create a sense of intimacy in the space, to allow people to connect to our storytellers, to make sure that we keep to time, to ensure that the audience understands the power of the platform that they're in and its intention, and to make sure that the energy stays up so that by the time Nsovo gets on stage, she has an audience that's ready to receive her.
Lebo speaks about the different countries across the continent and the stereotypes. I mean, the perceptions of what Kenya, Malawi, Zimbabwe is all about. But of course, as the stories come to the forefront, Pan-Africanism within storytelling, where does that originate from?
Well, if you look at where we come from, all of us have got a basis of how we got to where we are now. I mean, if you look at the traditional African storytelling, which was a role that was assigned to our grandparents. Yeah, so whenever you visited your grandmother or your grandfather, you know, they had stories to tell. For me, I always look forward to my grandmother's stories. Yeah. Okay, bless her soul. Yeah. So I always look forward to her stories. When you look at the Pan-Africanism within that is how we actually trace our heritage within the African continent, because unlike other continents around the world where they've got relics, they've got, you know, histories that have been written down for the past 2,000 years of where they come from. In Africa, unfortunately, we don't have so many of that. But then what we do have is the storytelling. You know, it's the stories that were handed down from one generation to the next. So for me, for example, there are many stories that I know about my family that I was not there to live through. It's from 400 years ago, where my grandmother would be telling me that your grandparents or my grandmother, when I was growing up, this is what she told me. So these are stories that I can hold on to and pass them on to my children, and they will pass them on to their children. So when you look at Pan-Africanism, I would say that storytelling for us, that is our heritage and that is where our history lies.
The power of storytelling, how does it shape our individuality, our identity as human beings?
Stories make us human. I mean, as you illustrated so beautifully, like it's how we enshrine memory, it's how we enshrine history, it's how we enshrine lineage, it's how we make sense of the world around us and the world within. For us, that boils down to human connection. You need people to be connected to each other in order for all of those things to remain active. And if you look at our history, so much of what we experienced through colonialism and apartheid was a sense of dislocation, was a sense of people being broken up, was a sense of people being removed from one place, taken to another place, lineages lost. As you spoke about, you know, our histories are not enshrined in the relics and the libraries that we have. They're enshrined in the people. So when you destroy the communities, you destroy the stories. But we have the power and the agency and the opportunity right now to be able to hold on to that, you know. So this is, I mean, the Moth has so many examples of opportunities for people to learn more about storytelling as a form, to learn more about storytelling as a platform for activism. But I also think for we here in South Africa, it's the importance of understanding that wherever I am, whoever I am, I have an important story. There's an opportunity for me to enshrine what is important to me here and now, whether that is my grandmother's story before she passes on, the story of the lineage of our family, how we ended up in Joburg, you know, or the story of what I am negotiating right now. You know, we've just lived through a pandemic. We're living through incredible transitions. If you are alive in this moment, you know, there's a lot that has happened, that is happening, and that is worthy of remembering. That in and of itself makes you important and is worthy of being documented.
Yeah. Absolutely mind-boggling. Really, really fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for both of you for coming in studio, Lebo Mashile as well as Nsovo Mayimele. Talking about the Moth, an exciting platform, captivating storytelling, which of course is going to be returning to Johannesburg on Saturday, the 16th of March, after a break, an 8-year break. Thank you to you both for coming in studio. Up next, the very latest in the world of sports, Rachel Makura standing by with those details.